April 1, 1924. Cicero, Illinois. The Hawthorne Smoke Shop. Morning light cuts through cigar smoke. A cash register chimes, and a man in a gray suit walks past the polling station next door, nodding to three others who follow without speaking. This is the true story of how a single election turned a quiet factory town into the most corrupt municipality in American history, and how the man who orchestrated it learned that absolute control carries a price no amount of money can cover. Al Capone wasn't born a crime lord. He became one by understanding leverage. By the spring of 1924, he'd been pushed out of Chicago by rivals who controlled the police, the courts, and the aldermen. He needed territory. He needed protection. He needed a government he could own outright. Cicero offered all three, but taking a town isn't the same as keeping it, and what Capone built in those 72 hours of election violence would haunt him for the rest of his life, not because he failed, but because he succeeded too completely. This isn't about bootlegging or bullets. It's about what happens when a criminal enterprise stops hiding and becomes the state itself. When there's no line left between law and lawlessness. When control becomes indistinguishable from chaos. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was 25 years old in 1924. Born in Brooklyn to Italian immigrants, he'd arrived in Chicago 3 years earlier with a knife scar across his left cheek and a reputation for enforcement work. He didn't drink. He was methodical. He understood numbers better than most accountants and violence better than most soldiers. By early 1924, he worked under Johnny Torrio, who controlled bootlegging operations on Chicago's South Side. But Chicago was fracturing. The North Side Irish gangs wanted expansion. Reform-minded Mayor William Dever, elected in 1923, had launched raids that cost Torrio's operation over $200,000 in confiscated liquor in just 4 months. The police who'd once looked away were now making arrests. Torrio made a decision: move the operation outside city limits. Find a place where the entire government could be purchased at once. Cicero sat just west of Chicago's border. Population 60,000. 14 saloons that served openly despite Prohibition. Factories that employed Bohemian and Polish immigrants who worked 6-day weeks and drank on Sundays. The town was run by President Joseph Klena and a town board that collected kickbacks from small-time gambling parlors but had never seen organized crime at industrial scale. Torrio saw infrastructure. Capone saw opportunity. In February 1924, Torrio told Capone to prepare for the April 1 municipal election. The incumbent board would lose. A slate of candidates favorable to the organization would win. The method didn't matter. The outcome did. Capone moved into Cicero 2 weeks later. He rented rooms above the Hawthorne Smoke Shop on 22nd Street and began mapping the town, not its streets, but its officials. Who took money? Who feared violence? Who could be convinced that cooperation meant survival? He brought his brother Ralph. He brought enforcers from the South Side. He brought cash in denominations that working men recognized as 6 months' salary. And he brought something else: the understanding that intimidation works best when it's systematic, visible, and irreversible. But on this day, everything was about to change. The election was scheduled for April 1. Early March, Capone met with the opposition slate, men running against Klena's board. He didn't threaten. He explained. If they won, the organization would provide protection from Chicago gangs looking to expand. If they won, their businesses would thrive. If they won, Cicero would become the most profitable town in Cook County. If they lost, they'd face competitors who wouldn't be as reasonable. The candidates agreed. Most had no idea what they were agreeing to. Capone's second step targeted the existing power structure. President Klena was brought to the Hawthorne Smoke Shop on March 10. The meeting lasted 19 minutes. Klena emerged pale, refused to answer reporters' questions, and stopped campaigning. Later testimony suggested Capone had shown him photographs, not of violence, but of Klena's family. Their school, their route home. The implication was enough, but across town, a detective named William Flaum was watching the same candidates Capone was courting. Flaum worked for the Chicago Police Department, not Cicero. He had no jurisdiction. He had no orders. But he'd been following Torrio's organization for 8 months, and he suspected the election was the key to something larger. By mid-March, the Hawthorne Smoke Shop had become the operational center. Cash moved in canvas bags. Enforcers checked in twice daily. Ralph Capone coordinated transportation, trucks that would move voters, block streets, control access to polling stations. The strategy was simple: Friendly voters would be driven to polls in waves. Unfriendly voters would find the streets blocked, their cars disabled, or their routes suddenly occupied by men who suggested they reconsider their civic duty. But Capone didn't rely on fear alone. He understood theater. On March 22, he hosted a fish fry outside the Hawthorne. 200 residents attended, free food, free beer, despite prohibition. Capone worked the crowd in shirt sleeves, shaking hands, learning names. He didn't present himself as a gangster. He presented himself as a businessman who cared about Cicero's prosperity, who wanted safe streets and good jobs, who simply asked for cooperation during a difficult transition. Most attendees left convinced he was reasonable. Some left convinced he was generous. A few left convinced he was something else entirely, but those few stopped talking about it. One of those few was a journalist named Robert Street. John, who worked for the Cicero Tribune. He attended the fish fry. He took notes. And he began asking questions about where the money was coming from, questions that reached Capone's attention within 48 hours. By March 28, the organization controlled both narratives and infrastructure. Capone had poll workers on his payroll. He had vehicles staged at 4 locations. He had men assigned to each of Cicero's 6 wards with instructions that were specific, written, and left no room for improvisation. The night before the election, Capone held a final meeting at the Hawthorne. 30 men attended. He reminded them that violence was a last resort, but a guaranteed one. That the goal wasn't chaos, it was certainty. That by midnight on April 1, Cicero would belong to the organization in every way that mattered. He said 3 sentences that witnesses later recalled. Nobody votes twice unless we tell them to. Nobody gets hurt unless they make it necessary. And if the police show up, you let me handle it. The men left. Capone stayed awake. He understood that the next 14 hours would determine whether he built an empire or died trying. But he didn't know that 70 miles away, a Cook County judge named Edmund Jarecki had just signed a warrant. April 1 began at dawn. Capone's men took positions outside polling stations before they opened. Voters arriving early found the streets crowded with unfamiliar faces. Some turned around. Some were escorted inside by men who stood close enough to see how they marked their ballots. By 8 a.m., reports of intimidation reached Chicago newspapers. By 9 a.m., calls flooded the Cook County Sheriff's Office. By 10 a.m., Detective William Flaum was driving toward Cicero with a problem. He had no jurisdiction, no backup, and no plan. But he wasn't alone. Judge Jarecki had deputized 79 Chicago police officers, giving them temporary authority in Cicero. They were en route. Flaum didn't know it yet. Neither did Capone. At the polling station on Roosevelt Road, a man named Michael Gavin attempted to vote against the Capone-backed slate. He was stopped at the door by 2 men who told him the station was full. When he protested, he was struck once in the face and dragged to a car. He was driven 6 blocks, thrown onto a sidewalk, and told to walk home. He did. Gavin wasn't the first. Court records later documented 43 similar incidents before noon. Voters beaten. Ballot boxes stolen and replaced. Poll watchers threatened at gunpoint. A clerk named Frank Olson, who questioned irregularities in the count, was locked in a basement for 3 hours. But Capone's operation wasn't random. It was surgical. He focused on wards where the vote was close. He ignored wards already won. He didn't flood every station with violence. He used just enough to shift the outcome, to create the appearance of a legitimate election that happened to go his way. The official story suggested grassroots support. The record showed something else. By 1 p.m., the deputized Chicago officers arrived in Cicero. 79 men in plain clothes, carrying badges and revolvers. They fanned out across the town, moving toward polling stations where the worst violence had been reported. At 1:40 p.m., they encountered Capone's enforcers outside the 22nd Street station. What happened next took 11 minutes. Across town, journalist Robert Street. John was documenting voter intimidation when he noticed a black sedan circling his block. He'd published a front-page article that morning questioning the source of funding behind the opposition slate. He realized, too late, that the article had named names. He fled into a drugstore. The sedan idled outside for 20 minutes, then left. Street. John stayed inside until after dark. His next article, published 3 days later, made no mention of Capone. The confrontation on 22nd Street began when one of the deputized officers, Patrolman William Sweeney, demanded that Capone's men step away from the polling station entrance. The men refused. Sweeney drew his weapon. So did 3 others. Gunfire followed. Not a shootout, an eruption. 17 rounds in 11 minutes. Voters scattered. The poll workers locked the doors. And in the chaos, Frank Capone, Al's younger brother, there to supervise Ward 6, stepped out of a doorway and raised his hands. He was shot twice. Once in the chest, once in the neck. He died on the sidewalk at 1:51 p.m. Al Capone was 2 blocks away when he heard. He arrived at the scene at 2:10 p.m., accompanied by Ralph and 4 enforcers. Police were still there, securing the area. Witnesses later described Capone as eerily calm. He looked at his brother's body. He looked at the officers. He said nothing. Then he left. That detail would matter later. By 4 p.m., Capone had pulled his men back from the most visible polling stations. The violence didn't stop, it relocated. Beatings moved to alleys. Intimidation became quieter. The officers stayed until polls closed at 6 p.m., but they couldn't be everywhere. At 11:30 p.m., the results were announced. The Capone-backed slate won every seat. President Clinton lost. The opposition candidates, now Capone's candidates, swept the board by margins that ranged from modest to improbable. Cicero belonged to the organization. Officially, legally, irreversibly. But the cost had just become visible. The days after the election moved in 2 directions. Publicly, the new town board took office and began passing ordinances that legalized gambling, protected speakeasies, and reduced police patrols in areas where the organization operated. Cicero's government became an extension of Capone's operation, rubber-stamping decisions that had been made in rooms above the Hawthorne smoke shop. Privately, Capone buried his brother. The funeral was held on April 4 at Mount Carmel Cemetery. Over 5,000 people attended, family, associates, and residents who came because they feared what would happen if they didn't. The floral arrangements cost over $20,000. Capone stood at the graveside in a black suit, flanked by Ralph and Johnny Torrio. He didn't speak, didn't weep. Witnesses described him as stone. But something had shifted. Within a week, Capone began restructuring operations. He promoted Ralph to oversee Cicero's day-to-day governance. He installed Jake Guzik, the organization's accountant, in an office 2 doors from the town clerk. And he ordered an audit of every officer involved in the April 1 shooting. Names, addresses, families, patterns. He wasn't planning revenge, he was planning insurance. By late April, Cicero had been transformed. The Hawthorne Inn, a luxury hotel Capone renovated, became the organization's headquarters. Gambling parlors operated openly on 22nd Street. Breweries ran 24-hour shifts in warehouses that local police were instructed to ignore. The town generated an estimated $200,000 per week in liquor sales alone. But pressure was building on 2 fronts. Detective William Flown, who'd witnessed the April 1 violence, filed a report with Cook County prosecutors recommending racketeering charges. The report named Capone directly. It documented ballot theft, voter intimidation, and bribery. It was detailed, credible, and politically inconvenient. The Cook County State's attorney, Robert Crow, reviewed the report. Then buried it. Crow had his own arrangements with the organization. Flown was reassigned to a desk job. He resigned 4 months later. The second front was internal. Johnny Torrio, who'd orchestrated the Cicero strategy, was growing cautious. The election had succeeded, but the attention it drew, newspapers, judges, federal agents, worried him. In January 1925, Torrio was ambushed outside his apartment by rival gang members and shot 5 times. He survived, barely. Upon recovering, he made a decision that stunned the underworld. He retired, handed the entire operation to Capone, left Chicago and never returned. At 26 years old, Capone became the undisputed head of the organization. Cicero was his. The South Side was his. The infrastructure, the payroll, the politicians, all his. But control is a kind of exposure. The more visible you are, the more enemies you collect. In late 1925, a reform-minded citizens group in Cicero began organizing petition drives to recall the town board. They gathered signatures, held meetings, published lists of ordinances they claimed were illegal. Capone responded not with violence but with bureaucracy. Town clerks rejected petitions for minor technicalities. Meetings were disrupted by fire inspections. The movement collapsed within 3 months. Optional, held for closure in climax, but one petitioner, a factory foreman named Anton Cermak, refused to stop. He sent letters to the state attorney general's office. He contacted federal authorities. He became a problem that couldn't be solved by intimidation alone. By 1926, Cicero was the most profitable, most corrupt, and most untouchable town in Illinois. Capone had built exactly what he intended: a government that answered to him, law enforcement that protected him, and an economy that depended on him. But Frank's death never left him. Those who knew Capone noticed changes. He drank more, rare for him. He became paranoid about security, traveling with armed escorts even in Cicero. And he began speaking about legitimacy, about moving into legal businesses, about leaving the life. It was too late to turn back. October 1926 brought convergence. Federal agents began investigating Cicero's gambling operations under the newly formed Prohibition Bureau. The investigation wasn't about liquor, it was about money. Where it came from, where it went, who controlled it. Capone recognized the threat immediately. Bootlegging was local, bribery was local, but tax evasion was federal. And federal prosecutors couldn't be bought as easily as town clerks. He hired accountants to create paper trails that showed legitimate income. He placed assets in relatives' names. He began closing operations that left obvious records. But the problem wasn't what he was doing, it was what he'd already done. 3 years of unfiltered control in Cicero had created evidence that couldn't be erased. Every payoff left a ledger entry. Every bribe required a withdrawal. Every gambling parlor generated cash that had to be moved, counted, and stored. The empire he'd built in 72 hours was generating the documentation that would eventually destroy him. In December 1926, Capone met with his inner circle, Ralph, Busick, and 3 others, in a private dining room at the Hawthorne Inn. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Witnesses weren't present, but what emerged was clear: the organization would begin distancing itself from visible operations. Front men would take ownership. Records would be compartmentalized. Capone himself would step back from daily oversight. The strategy made sense. The timing didn't. By early 1927, the federal investigation had expanded. Agents raided warehouses, subpoenaed bank records, interviewed town officials who suddenly remembered very little. And they focused on one question: how did Alphonse Capone, who reported no taxable income, afford a lifestyle that included multiple properties, luxury vehicles, and a personal staff of 20? Capone understood, too late, what he'd traded for control: anonymity for visibility, deniability for dominance, the protection of shadows for the exposure of success. He'd won Cicero, and Cicero had marked him. The moment that defined the rest of Al Capone's life didn't happen in Cicero. It happened in a federal courtroom in Chicago on October 17, 1931, 7 years after the election that made him untouchable. The trial lasted 11 days. Prosecutors presented evidence not of murder or bootlegging, but of income. They showed a man who owned nothing on paper but controlled everything in practice. They detailed cash flows, expenditures, and properties that couldn't be explained by legitimate work. The defense argued that Capone was a businessman. That gambling wasn't illegal in Cicero, technically true, given the ordinances his town board had passed. That income from illegal sources wasn't taxable, a legal argument that failed spectacularly. On October 24, 1931, the jury returned a verdict: guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. Capone sat motionless as the verdict was read. Reporters noted that his expression didn't change, that he showed no emotion. But those who knew him recognized something else: the realization that the control he'd fought for in 1924 had become the evidence that convicted him in 1931. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever imposed for tax evasion at that time. In the courtroom hallway afterward, a reporter asked him if he had regrets. Capone said 3 words. Just 3 words: I own Cicero. And everything changed. It wasn't about defiance. It was about recognition. That ownership is a kind of testimony. That power leaves fingerprints. That the town he'd taken in a single day had taken everything from him in return. Capone entered federal prison in May 1932. He served time in Atlanta, then Alcatraz, where the isolation and declining health from untreated syphilis eroded the man who'd once commanded an empire. He was released in 1939, his sentence reduced for good behavior, but his mind was failing. He lived the final 8 years of his life in his Florida estate, largely incapacitated. He died on January 25, 1947, at age 48. His estate, once valued in the millions, was consumed by legal fees and tax liens. The government claimed what the streets couldn't. Cicero, meanwhile, took decades to recover. The town board Capone installed remained in power until 1950, when a wave of federal indictments finally broke the organization's grip. Gambling continued openly until the mid-1960s. The Hawthorne Inn was demolished in 1970. 22nd Street, once the center of the most profitable criminal operation in American history, became a strip of vacant lots and struggling businesses. Ralph Capone, who ran Cicero's daily operations, was convicted of tax evasion in 1930 and served 3 years. He died in 1974, penniless and forgotten. Jake Guzik, the accountant, remained with the organization until his death in 1956. He was never convicted. Those who handle the books rarely are. And Anton Cermak, the foreman who refused to stop petitioning against the Capone board, became mayor of Chicago in 1931. On February 15, 1933, he was shot in Miami while standing next to President-elect Franklin Roosevelt. The gunman, Giuseppe Zangara, claimed he was targeting Roosevelt. But Cermak died of his wounds, and the question of whether it was an assassination or an accident remains unresolved. What Capone understood too late was that control is temporary, but testimony is permanent. That every bribe is a record. Every threat is a witness. Every victory is evidence. He took Cicero in 72 hours. It took him 7 years to realize that the town had taken him first. And when the trial ended, when the sentence was read, when the prison doors closed, it became clear that power isn't what you seize. It's what seizes you.